This is a 155mm artillery shell, one of the key ammunitions used in Ukraine.
Military officials estimate that Ukraine needs 200,000 a month to actually fight this war, to keep on par with Russia, and US capacity at somewhere around 28,000, therefore there is a large deficit.
Then the war in Gaza broke out, with the Israeli army using the same type of artillery shell. And now Kyiv has said that deliveries of the vital ammunition have gone down since that conflict started. Here's how the 155mm round became one of the most sought-after artillery calibers in the world, and how the US and its allies are ramping up production. The 155mm artillery shell was adopted as a NATO standard caliber after the Second World War. Military experts with defense intelligence firm Janes say the shell became popular because it balances range, warhead size, and damage on the target. The 155mm round is mainly used in Western howitzer systems. Essentially, it looks like a very large bullet, made up of a steel casing, fuse, and explosive fill. A standard round is about 2 feet long, weighs about 100 pounds, and it's 155mm or 6 inches in diameter.
155 is basically a measurement, and it measures the back of the shell, so other than that you can do pretty much what you want as long as it has that caliber and therefore fits into a barrel that can fire that.
The 155mm shell can be configured in many ways. They can be packed with highly explosive material, produce high fragmentation, or use precision-guided systems.
Within that you have something like this, which is an Excalibur shell, and that runs on GPS, but if you look at these fins here that come out, actually guide it in its flight.
Major producers have also been experimenting with the shell's range.
And this is something called a ramjet shell, and it works by using oxygen that comes in through the front and then oxidizes the fuel, and therefore it needs less fuel so it can go further.
Norwegian weapons manufacturer Nammo, which is developing the ramjet shell in partnership with Boeing, says the new ammunition will be able to travel up to 90 miles. That's 6 times further than what the standard shell can cover, which is about 15 miles. In Ukraine, the 155mm shell quickly became one of the most requested munitions after allies started to send their artillery systems to Kyiv. Since 2022, Kyiv has received more than 300 Western howitzers, and the US has provided over 2 million rounds of ammunition.
Artillery is hugely important in the Ukraine war, and Russia brought to bear its very large artillery assets, and Ukraine obviously followed suit. The other thing, it's a very, very long and at the moment quite static front line, so artillery is good for that. And then people realize that most countries don't have vast stockpiles of missiles for a variety of reasons, one of which they're complex and more expensive to make.
Since the war in Ukraine broke out, the price for standard 155mm shells has gone up from about $2,100 to $8,400 apiece, according to NATO officials. This is still much cheaper than missiles which can cost millions of dollars, like the Storm Shadow missiles used in Ukraine. NATO estimates that Russia fires up to 30,000 artillery rounds per day, 5 times more than what Ukraine can respond with. Some military experts say Western arsenals were not ready for an artillery battle of that intensity.
Stockpiles weren't particularly high, and the West realized that it didn't really have the capacity to fill the gaps very quickly, so it became very, very problematic very soon.
The US, Europe, and South Korea are the main manufacturers of the 155mm shell. Before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the US Army, which owns ammunition production facilities in the States, produced about 14,000 shells a month. But since 2022, Washington has been pumping billions of dollars into retooled factories to produce more rockets, missiles, shells, and rocket motors. It has issued almost $25 billion in contracts to arm Ukraine and replenish US stocks. In a year and a half, the production of the 155mm shell doubled. By 2025, Washington plans to produce up to 80,000 shells a month, according to Army officials. On the other hand, the EU, where factories producing ammunition are privately owned, has struggled to provide Ukraine with more shells.
The US Army can say, we want more shells, and obviously that has to prioritise. European manufacturers have said, despite this huge demand, they're not getting actual orders saying we want this amount of shells for this amount of time, and then they're not getting those orders looking into the future that would give them the confidence to expand capacity.
Israel's war on Hamas militants created new challenges to the global supply of ammunition. By December, the US sent roughly 57,000 rounds of the 155mm artillery shell to Israel. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin has said the US was able to support both Ukraine and Israel. Military experts also note that the Israeli operations in Gaza don't rely on artillery as heavily as Ukraine, suggesting that the effects of the war in Gaza on the global demand for the 155mm shell could be limited.
Israel uses a lot more munitions that Ukraine doesn't really have, so it just uses a lot more missiles, and it uses its air force more than Ukraine can.
In order to combat ammunition shortages, the Ukrainian Minister for Strategic Industries announced in December that Kyiv agreed with 2 American firms to jointly manufacture 155mm shells in Ukraine. However, production won't start for at least 2 years.
The problem is not just supplying Ukraine, but it's building up your own stockpiles as well, which obviously Western countries need to do. So they've all promised massive increases, but as the European Union has shown, that's more difficult to achieve than one would imagine.